I don't understand how you can call yourself a Christian and vote for blank. I don't understand how you can call yourself a Christian and be a Democrat, be a Republican. If you've found yourself saying or thinking something like that, then this podcast is for you. This is our Peacemakers in a Divided Culture podcast, where we talk about controversial and divisive issues in a reasonable and hopefully humble way, where we seek to understand where somebody else is coming from. We started this back in June, July. We talked about the race issue, and now, because we're in the middle of an election climax, we're talking about politics, and we're talking specifically about how our faith in Jesus should inform our politics, but we're not just having Christians on, we're having non-Christians on, and we're hopefully representing different stories and different experiences and why people think differently, sometimes about how to achieve the same results, but have different strategies for that. Ultimately, and I've preached on this numerous times, ultimately, our allegiance as Christians is to another kingdom. We belong to Jesus. We belong to his kingdom. Scripture says that we're part of the chosen race, the royal priesthood, and that we're only aliens in this world. And yet Scripture calls us to be faithful aliens, to be faithful to bless the land in which we live, to love and to be good citizens, to pray for those kings and rulers who are in charge. And so how do we balance that? How do we make sure that our ultimate hope is in Jesus and his coming kingdom, while also being faithful to live in this present world with its broken systems, doing the best we can to be faithful with them, being informed, voting or not voting, but doing so according to our conscience and having our conscience informed by our faith. So my ultimate hope for this podcast is that you will learn something about perhaps why somebody thinks differently, and also be inspired to have humble conversations with people who disagree with you. It is likely that any one particular podcast or interview with somebody is going to bother you, or you're going to feel like, but wait a minute, my side isn't being represented and validated. Well, just slow down. My hope is that by the end of this, we're going to do 7 or 8 of these leading up to the election, and my hope is that by the end, we'll have a very diverse, very varied perspectives represented on this podcast, and hopefully that our church community can really say, you know what, I see that other side a little bit more. Okay, I get it a little bit more. Okay, you know what, I'm going to have a conversation a little bit more respectful. I'm not just going to talk to people who I agree with and make sideways comments about that other group that I disagree with, and snicker about them. No, we're gonna really do a better job loving each other through election seasons. That's my hope. This week's episode is with Tom Sargent. It was meant to be a follow-up with Tom Sargent and Lee Nelson from week 1, but Lee had to drop out at the last minute. Something came up for him, so it's just an interview with Tom Sargent. But I get to ask Tom about where he disagrees with his own tribe or his own party, and just find out how nuanced people's views can actually be. And then next week is going to be Jack and Lori Miskin, a couple in our church, leaders in our church, and they share the other perspective. Enjoy today, and then tune in next week. All right, so Tom, you suggested, we kind of left off last week with a great question that you both wanted to discuss, you and Lee. Where are each of you not aligned with your own camp/tribe? Where do Tom and Lee stray from the Republican platform/Democratic platform, respectively? So to you, as a Republican, a conservative, where do you stray from the stereotype? Or the Republic, or what is the literal Republican Party platform?
So there's probably a couple of areas. I would say one of the more clear or common areas where I tend to differ from the general Republican Party line is on guns. I don't really have the zeal for guns that many in the conservative camp do. I mean, I don't personally like them or feel like I have any use for them in my life, but I also don't feel like preventing any restrictions on them is appropriate. I don't agree that not studying gun violence is the way to act like there's not, a problem with gun violence in our country, and that even though it is people committing the things, committing the crimes, that it's these things are a lot harder to do without guns. Like, they are part of the problem. I mean, I can't deny that altogether. Now, that's not to say I'm as rabidly, I would guess, anti-gun as some people on the far left would be, as far as confiscating everybody's weapons. I respect the Constitution and that we do have the right to have them, but I am also more in favor of more sensible application of that. I feel like guns are a great responsibility that is far too readily available to the irresponsible. Right? Far too readily available to the proliferation of guns that we have in this country per capita. And I don't oppose things like universal background checks or limits on magazine size and things like that. So I am probably a bit more towards the middle or left as far as it comes to guns and gun regulations, because I do see them as part of a problem, not the problem themselves, but part of a problem. And I always I would joke with Lee. I think I maybe have joked with you on this, like saying that the best job I think to have would be spokesperson for the NRA, because it pays well, and the answer to everything is just more guns, right? We got bad guys good with guns. We need good guys with guns. We got people shooting up schools. We need teachers with guns. There's more guns. It is the simplest job you could have, and I'm sure it pays pretty well. So I wouldn't actually mind that gig, even though I don't care for the guns. But that's one way in which I think I would stray from that conservative line. And to be honest, if I we're interested in running for politics, it's something that probably would disqualify me on that ticket, because it's such a big deal. It seems like any restrictions on guns whatsoever is very taboo in that regard. So that's an area where I don't meet up with the classic party platform, I'd say.
Okay. So even though last week you were talking about limited government not putting their hands into everything, you do feel like this is an area where the government does need to provide more legislation, more regulations.
In a way, as a public safety concern.
Okay.
Again, I'm not saying to repeal people's right to own these things, but having some form of restriction on it in response to the scope of the problem, I think would be reasonable.
That makes sense. Now, I also am aware of your stance on, you alluded to it last week, your stance on capital punishment.
Yes.
And that, yeah. I mean, that's not really a part of the official platform, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, not to my knowledge, but I think in general, the conservative crowd is a bit more supportive of the death penalty, generally speaking.
Yeah. So, and how come you're not?
Because for the same reasons I'm against abortion, I'm against the death penalty. As I said, last time, I don't support situations where one human is choosing to actively end the life of another human. In the cases of things like abortion, it's the same reason I don't approve of euthanasia in that regard. I think that's a power that we usurp from God, to be quite honest with you. I think God decides when people die and when people live. All right. I mean, there's obviously tragedies and things happen all the time, but just deciding, all right, this person needs to die because I say so. I don't approve of that sort of thing. I think that's the power over life and death is God's and should be God's. And I think it's incredible hubris of us to think that we should wield that, based on, our whims or our desires at the time. It also doesn't allow really for the ultimate forgiveness that comes from God. I mean, it's a final punishment. I mean, there's no sin that can't be forgiven. As vile as some of these people are, there's not a sin that can't be forgiven. Not saying they shouldn't be in jail for the rest of their lives and punished accordingly, but to decide that their life needs to end because you think that they have crossed that line between just being punished and being killed. I don't support that. I think valuing the sanctity of human life. The reason why I don't approve of abortion is transferred to the reason why I don't support the death penalty.
Well, yeah. So I got a few questions off of that.
Mhm.
Why do you think I'll just call them a stereotypical conservative is anti-abortion, anti-euthanasia, pro-capital punishment? Why do you think that is? Like, why that inconsistency there?
I mean, I can't speak for everyone else, but if I were to take my best guess at it, I think the conservative platform is pretty heavy on law and order, generally speaking. Appropriate punishment for appropriate crimes and individual accountability and personal responsibility for your actions. I think they see that as the sort of the ultimate manifestation of that. I just think that's a step too far when you claim a life.
Hmm.
That's my person. I'm not opposed, and I don't think my disagreement with capital punishment is in any way uh, some sort of commentary on my overall view on law enforcement and crime and punishment. I'm very much on the pro law enforcement side, and that people need to pay for their crimes, and this new push to not prosecute anything, and to be this not having strict bail for people, or not prosecuting these lesser crimes. I'm not super supportive of all of that. So I think people need to obey the rules or pay the consequence of the rules. I just don't think the consequence of those rules should be their life.
Mm, mm. Is there anything else? Capital punishment, gun control. Is there anything else where you stray from the typical?
Um, so not necessarily entirely straying from a platform. Like, I think I definitely support capitalist economies, free market economies, individual liberties, things like that. But I mean, I think there's some people to the extreme who would go towards like no regulation of any of that, and I think that is a bit much. Like, the term would be like anarcho-capitalism, like old days robber barons, no rules, no regulations. That is not the direction I think we need to be going. I think that we have a Securities and Exchange Commission for a reason. We have some reasonable checks and balances on industry, but yeah, I'm not saying I stray entirely from that. I'm just not as um, extreme towards the I want less government intervention, but I don't think like it needs to be like the wild, wild west of industry, like it was in the Rockefeller Carnegie days, or things like that.
Right. And
So that so yeah, it's a hard balance to draw because you don't want to interfere too much, but you also don't want to have absolutely no you know rule whatsoever. I mean, there's law and order in society. There is some law that applies to the business world too.
yeah. So, what would you say is the role as a conservative, if you had to sum it up, the role of the federal government?
The role of the federal government is to provide us with a military for our safety, to build our bridges and pave our streets, so we provide infrastructure
Okay.
so we can get around. And other than that, I don't need too much more from them. Honestly, like uh, they're I want them to provide safety to our country. Through, again, whether it be through military, uh, you know, provisions, or what have you, and provide structure to our country so that we can conduct a civilized society. But I don't need them to distribute people's wealth. I don't think it's the government's job to decide who gets how much. I think that's people's individual jobs to earn or not earn their living and support themselves as best they can. I think they need to provide some level of safety net to fall back on for those who can't, but there's varying degrees of that, and I think um, I'd probably be towards the lesser end of intervention on that side. But yeah, aside from providing for our safety, providing for our infrastructure, and overseeing our you know international interests, I don't need a whole lot from the government,
Yeah.
and I don't want them to interfere with a whole lot more.
Okay. Okay. So um, but you would say, and you said last week, like enforcing laws that protect life.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah. So law enforcement is also sort of a part of ensuring our safety. I
Okay,
think the
great.
government needs to provide law enforcement. Thanks for making that clarification. Absolutely.
Okay,
So yeah,
okay.
they need to provide our police and military services, and I'd appreciate it if they provided garbage pickup, some of those public works. But the as far as all the other stuff, I think we can do without it.
The conservative, you would have um, disagreed with the Southern conservatives who believed it wasn't the federal government's job to come in and tell them to, um, integrate schools and um, when the federal government was breaking up segregation in the 60s and the response was it's not your job, stay out of this, you would have said no, this falls under protecting life and enforcing justice. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't oppose them doing that because I think that's clearly the morally right thing to do. But I wouldn't necessarily oppose it um, from a government uh, standpoint either. I know there's always that battle between hands off and what needs to be done. But no, I wouldn't oppose them enforcing federal rule of in like integration and things like that, because I mean that's not, to me, that's not like the government enforcing a moral choice or like legislating morality necessarily. All right, that's a justice issue and not a morality issue.
Mm-hmm.
So we want them to stay out of morality, legislation. I don't think that really applies there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would not have necessarily opposed them, stepping in that regard.
Hmm. What do you make of somebody's response saying like, well, providing money for, let's go with healthcare. You're a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Help me understand a little bit. Many see that as a justice thing. Many see that as this is life. We're talking about people's lives here. This isn't a moral choice. This isn't this is life. This is justice. Um, how do you separate that out? Because you're not healthcare for everybody, right?
No, no.
So practically speaking, why are you against healthcare for everybody? And then philosophically, why are you against it? If you just said that the government should be, like, how would you argue that that's not a justice issue?
Um, it's, to me, it's not a justice issue as it's as much as we value it as a service, it's still a service.
Okay.
Healthcare provided by professionals is a service,
Okay.
and it's something that certainly people should value, I think, and should put, prioritize their resource allocation to obtaining, healthcare. Maybe prioritize that over some other things that they otherwise prioritize. And having that be part of employment benefits and things like that, I'm very much in favor of. But healthcare is a highly specialized service provided by highly trained people who have to go through a lot of training and effort to provide it at the levels that's required. Because with the regulation in our country, we can't just be providing healthcare just from anybody. There's a lot of licensing and testing requirements. It's a huge investment, and granted, the pricing has gotten a bit crazy as far as affordability goes. But at the end of the day, it's still a service that has to be provided by people. If you want to give it to everybody, you have to sacrifice somewhere, right? So you can either have what's the three guys? You can have availability, affordability, and high quality. You can generally get two of those things, but not all three. All right. Because if it's available to everyone, all right, and you're going to, have it to be, high quality, highly trained, utmost of facilities, it's not going to be affordable. It's going to get astronomically expensive, right? So if you want it to be, affordable, and available to everybody, then you're going to have to sacrifice on quality because you're not going to be able to pay for that quality. People who go into the profession know that there is job stability and economic reward from it. You are not going to get the same buy-in to the profession when those things go away. All right, so and that's been shown in economic upturns and downturns and things like that. In economic downturns, generally med school applications skyrocket because it's job stability and it's one of the few well-paying jobs they know they're going to have. And when the economy's going good, generally the medical school applications drop down a bit because they can make a lot of money a lot easier elsewhere. So it's just, just a fact of life. So the balance between availability, quality, and affordability is generally you can have two of those three. I think it's hard to have all three in spades. I just don't think that's logistically possible.
Gotcha.
So to me, again, it's as tough as it is for some people, to hear, knowing that some people will be kind of left out of that. And we do supply emergency medical care to everybody in this, country, as needed, that nobody gets turned away from hospitals and things like that. After they check for your insurance, they still treat you. But for some people, that's all that's available. But in recent years, it's shrunk. Medicaid's been vastly expanded, so the amount of people uninsured has gone down. But yeah, to me, it's still a service that has to be provided, and if it's going to be provided at a high level, you're going to have to sacrifice either affordability or availability. Gotcha. One of the two. So the dream of having universally available, high quality, low cost healthcare is honestly, it's a dream. It'll bankrupt our country if we try to do it. That's the logistical side of it. It's not affordable. Healthcare is usually the biggest budget item in our country's budget already. All right, and if we expand it, it's like if we try to make that universal, it's a behemoth of a financial undertaking. Okay. And none of the, I don't think any of the plans now even come close to paying for what that's actually going to turn out to be.
Tom, can we before I transition, I want to talk about this upcoming election.
Yeah, what about
it? Before I transition to that, are there any topics that you wanted to tackle or talk about?
Basically, the question that Lee forwarded to you, I don't know if you wanted to tackle that in this talk or do it separately, about basically about socialism.
Why is socialism a dirty word for conservatives? Yeah. You know what? That's right. He stuck that question to you, or for conservatives. So let's hear it. It's, to be fair, it would be something to have him also chime in on. Yes. or somebody who's a self-professed liberal chime in on. But since you're here, why is it a dirty word for conservatives?
Yeah, so that's how Lee framed the question, is why is socialism a dirty word for conservatives? I think that's actually a misleading framing of that question, because it assumes that only conservatives don't like socialism or it's a problem for them. And if that was the case, then Bernie Sanders would be the Democratic nominee, right? If socialism wasn't a dirty word for not only conservatives, but people in the Democratic Party also who call themselves liberals, many of whom are rightfully wary of socialism. But to try to answer it from a conservative standpoint, like why it's like a political dirty word to someone who's conservative, actually a lot of reasons, mostly because of the staggering repetitive track record of failure almost everywhere it's been tried, and the general result being widespread poverty, starvation, the development of dictatorships, and vast human rights abuses and loss of life that follow socialism everywhere it goes. It should be generally a dirty word to everybody. And this has been shown throughout history, almost every time it's been tried. And people will point to some like Scandinavian countries and say, yeah, it's working there. Not really, and they're not really socialist countries. But I mean, even from when it was, first started, the socialism basically encompasses state control or government control of what they said the means of production. So basically, it becomes government control of industry, services, and everything, and then supposedly redistributed evenly to the people who try to make everything equitable. But it never ever works. All right, it always leads to a new oligarchy. The oligarchy may switch from the top of the corporate world to the government, but it's all in the government. All right, and it leads to ironically, mostly leads to fascist governments, and these people who support it claim to be the anti-fascist group. And it's led to fascist governments everywhere it's gone. After the most famous socialist party, if you want to call them that, was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which most people refer to as the Nazis. And Hitler was a self-proclaimed socialist. Now, whether he governed like that is a matter of contention. You can make the argument he didn't, but they rose to power as a socialist party, and that was followed by murderous dictators like Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao Zedong. I mean, that guy starved and killed about 45 million people in China over his reign. I mean, there's a path of destruction, and the reason it happens is because it constantly concentrates all the power in the government. So the new royalty is just the government, and they can enrich themselves. And as long as they're keeping everybody else equal, they can keep them equally as poor as they want. They can drop down the standard of living as low as they want. And it completely takes out individual pursuit of excellence, of wealth. Those things become less and less, achievable for the quote unquote greater good. So if you take, any of those examples from history, like what happened to all these countries, it generally leads to the failure of these states. Like what happened to the USSR, right? What happened to countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia? They don't exist anymore, right? Ask yourself, would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea if you think socialism is a better option than capitalism, right? Would you rather have lived in East Germany or West Germany, right? So these socialist states fail over and over again, and it's a denial of math, and it's denial of human nature, all right? Then once you take away the link between reward and effort goes away. Like if you can't work harder and achieve more and succeed more, why are you going to keep working? Or if the government just keeps giving you more, you're going to keep working for the common good? I mean, I think welfare in our country has said pretty clearly that you won't. Right? If the government just keeps giving you free everything, healthcare and education, free free checks basically for drawing a pulse with like universal basic income, what motivation is there for you to go out and work and earn? And when less people are working and earning, there's nobody to tax, right? You need to build wealth to tax people enough to provide all these social programs. So mathematically, it doesn't work out, because once you institute that, you crush wealth, and there's no wealth to tax to supply the machine that you're setting up in the first place. So it's a self-defeating process. So not only has it failed everywhere, it doesn't mathematically add up. And if you know anything about people, they won't continue to strive to work for excellence in that system. You'll crush innovation because you won't have competition amongst companies to provide low-cost goods to people to succeed. It's just an overall disaster. Look, I mean, it took Venezuela from being the richest country in South America to being an absolute destitute dumpster fire in 15 years. And of course, Hugo Chavez's daughter and the Treasury Secretary are like the two richest people still left in that country, and they didn't do anything except for work for the government. All right, and then Maduro wasn't any better when he took over. So it's a constant failure. It's done nothing but leave disasters in its wake, usually ending in murderous dictatorial regimes. So I think it should be a dirty word for just about everybody.
Well, you're going to inspire some people to want to jump on this podcast and respond to that. I know there's a few people who are lined up to jump on. We'll have to hear their side of it a little bit. Well, let me give you one more common rebuttal that I hear particularly among Christians, and that's doesn't the Bible promote socialism? You look at Acts 2 and Acts 4, and it says nothing they had was their own, and they gave and they shared. What do you say to
that? Yeah, so I say the Bible promotes charity, not forced charity. All right, socialism, pretty much taxes in general are forced charity. We live with a certain amount of them, but socialism is state enforced involuntary charity, as we'll say. They're going to take away everything from you to care for them. And honestly, most of it, I think, gets eaten up by the governments and doesn't go to the people who really need it. But I am all for the church being more involved in charitable ways and taking care of the poor and the disadvantaged from the church directly out of their own hearts and out of their own funds, and for people to do that in general. I am not for the government mandating that you do that. Worldwide, if you look at a capitalist and free market, economies have been responsible for taking the vast majority of the population worldwide out of the extreme poverty level based on world standards. I think in like the last 100, is either the last 100 or 150 years, and Steven Pinker does some work on this in his talks. So basically 2 billion people worldwide have been taken out of the worldwide poverty level according to World Bank standards. It's not a lot for US standards, but there was something like 80% of the world population was living under that standard 150 years ago, and now it's like 10%. All right, and they have a goal of eradicating it by like 2030. All right, so these things have proven successful. Now, not everybody gets, not everybody's Jeff Bezos, obviously. All right, so not everybody gets that same share of the pie, but that sort of theory that a rising tide lifts all boats, all right, which was actually a speech by noted conservative greedmonger John F. Kennedy right before he cut taxes. Talking about how the rising economy helps all people. I mean, you get people out of poverty. They don't need as much of your charity. You have fewer people in need of the charity if more people are well off. And more people are never well off in a socialist system. It creates widespread poverty all the time. All the time.
Hey,
I agree with you that capitalism allows for the most greed, but also allows for the most charity and allows for the most wealth generation that provides charity.
Yeah. And that's where I think just the role of the church comes into play, and I agree with you.
I think we've abdicated that role largely.
Yeah.
In recent decades and centuries, I think we've fallen off of what. Again, I'm not sure if we can logistically still do it like they used to, but like the church is a provider of elder care and health care and orphan care and the poor and needy in general used to be our jam. We used to own that, and now we just abdicated to the government.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking back, what you know about history, when you look back at the presidents or the administrations who were Democratic, whether it's even in the last 100 years, FDR, JFK, Johnson, Truman, Carter, Clinton, Obama, that cover them all. I think it covers them all. When you look back at those, what you know about history, could you say, you know what, where I stand now and where they stood then, I probably could have voted for them. I probably could have lined up with them pretty closely.
Yeah. I could vote for Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
Bill Clinton running today would be a Republican. Like, he's the last Democrat I know who actually cared about economic prosperity. It's amazing. Like, economic prosperity is not really on the docket. Like, Joe Biden is trying to talk about Buy American now, which is, nobody's disagreeing with that. Actually, the other side's saying that too. But like, economic prosperity has not been like a recent part of the Democratic plan, partially because of the socialism angle that a lot of them take, partially because the far left fringe apparently sees economic prosperity as not a cause to be followed. But I think it's because it's actually detrimental to the greater part of their plan. The more economic prosperity we have in this country, the less people need social programs, the less they need government. The less you need government, the less the Democratic platform appeals to you. So economic prosperity has actually, I think, become detrimental to where they've come. But 20 something years ago when Clinton was running, it was actually a focus on economic prosperity at the time, and they did pretty well with it. They ushered in a solid economy. So I think if someone like Bill Clinton was running, I could probably get behind voting for him. Obama in 2008, I couldn't vote for that.
Okay.
He was already too far left for me.
So you just made me think of something else. There seems to be and both sides are guilty of it, but there seems to be the misnomer that you want economic prosperity because you're greedy and you don't care about the poor, And what I'm hearing you say is, no, no, no. Economic prosperity is for the sake of the poor. That will lift more people up out of poverty, rather than leaning on and depending on the government. Is that fair to say?
And 100%, as we were saying with the capitalist societies, how they, that rising tide lifts all boats thing, the JFK
Yeah.
line.
So it's not a matter of values being different, but a strategy being different.
Yeah, it's teach a man to fish or give him a fish. I mean, just giving people stuff, doesn't do it. If you create more job growth, create a better economy, jobs where people can support themselves, they don't need to rely on the government as much. So that job and wealth generation happens much, much, much more in a free market capitalist society than it does in a socialist government dominated
Okay.
economy. So that's like if
Yeah, I want to.
personally, if I stay where I am, I'm fine. I'm not, it's not a matter of, pursuing a certain greed level. It's everybody does better under the system. Everybody, even the poor, like they always talk about the wealth gaps and, the rich are, the concentration of money up at the top, the rich are getting, richer. The poor aren't generally getting poorer. If you look at, they're kind of either staying the same or some of the poor have, elevated, recent years, the median income, I think before the COVID stuff, median household income in the country had gone up like $5,000 in the last 3 years. So, I mean, progress is being made, across the board. And the share of money that is in the poorest quintile, I was looking at a chart from Pew Research the other day, for that lowest quintile is like 9 to 10%. And that's actually stayed pretty commonly even. So it's not like we're creating this class of ultra poor that are poorer than they've ever been or anything like that. So the better the economic situation is, generally everybody does better. Right? Granted, people at the top do more better, if you want to say, than people in the middle or the bottom. Definitely, that's why we have like the richest man who's ever lived, living right now and running Amazon. But the fact is, generally everybody does better. That tide lifts all boats, as staunch Republican JFK would tell you. So yeah, I was too young to vote for him. But like me now, if a same guy was running on Bill Clinton's platform, I wouldn't mind necessarily, voting based on what he did anyway. I won't say I remember his campaign speeches, but based on what he wound up doing, I wouldn't necessarily mind voting for a guy who planned on doing what he did, economically, even in, running the country, even internationally wasn't terrible. So not necessarily condoning his extracurricular activities per se, but honestly, those are significantly less important to me. I don't really care.
Well, that's a good segue. That's what I wanted to talk about. You seem to be the epitome of a pragmatist, and not an idealist. You seem to have no expectation of our president being a moral leader or a moral example for our nation. Is that fair to say? And
Yeah.
how do you reconcile that as a Christian who is called to extol the values of Christ?
Yeah, and you should extol the value of Christ. You just don't need to require them to be identical in the person who happens to have the job of running the country at the time, necessarily. It would be nice to have, a strong Christian man in leadership. Is it necessary? To me, not necessarily, because what matters is the policy. I mean, even though Clinton was a philandering liar, as it were, if he got the job done for the country and the economy prospered and the country was safe, then I'm all for it. I mean, it's the results, it's the policies to me that matter. Because let's say, down the road, if you're suffering in a socialist, dystopia, and you're they tax the lungs out of you, you lose all the stuff, everybody's poor, people are starving. Is it going to matter that the guy who put you there was, woke, or like that he was morally upright? I mean, it's nice, but you're not voting for these people for brother-in-law. Like, you're not voting for them to marry your sister. Like, if they happen to be liars or cheaters, in their personal lives, I mean, I prefer they wouldn't be, but honestly, that is a distant second, if not later down the road, compared to what the policies are going to be and how that's going to affect our country overall. So, they can, well, as I don't condone cheating on your wife, it doesn't necessarily, it's not as important as what you're going to do for your country.
So you don't try to. Okay, so let me put a couple more questions to you
Yeah.
specifically as it relates to Trump, because you voted for Trump
Yep.
in 2000. So you had no qualms about voting for Trump because of his moral history, um, or his rhetoric. You had no qualms about that. You were simply looking at the bottom line. What are the policies going to be? Is that fair to say, or did you have any type of qualms?
No, no, dude, that's very fair to say. I didn't, would I prefer to have voted for someone who wasn't a blowhard and, bombastic and crude like him? Sure. But, I wasn't given the chance to vote for President Cruz or Rubio. So, that being said, his personality flaws, many as they may be, don't really factor that much into it. I mean, I'm not looking for him to be the moral example to my kids. Like if I'm looking for the president to be the moral example to my kids, I've failed as a parent, right? That's my job. That's not the president's job.
Hmm.
All right. President's job is to run the country and to make it prosper. Right. So if he's going to do that, I don't care if he's, I don't, it doesn't, not that I don't like care overall. I mean, I prefer that he wasn't like a liar or a cheat, but honestly, if he's running the country and instituting the policies that I think are going to best benefit the country, yeah, it does not stop me if he is a jerk.
Hmm. Do you find a do you have a problem with conservatives who feel the need to defend Trump's every move on Twitter?
I have the problem with anybody who feels the need to ideologically defend anybody's anything. If you can't recognize that Trump is an over tweeting, overly sensitive, I don't want to say anything we can't, put on the church podcast,
We can
but
do the bleep bleep bleep.
but I mean, I don't really curse, but like I don't want to use any, I don't want to offend anybody. But if you can't recognize like that he has obvious personality flaws and that he is, frequently an idiot and a jerk, like come on, like you don't have to defend the guy's every move, because if you can't see the flaws in somebody, if you can't recognize the flaws in somebody, then you're not seeing things realistically. That's ideology. It's like we talked about last time with having your politics as your religion. Like if you think that everything Trump says is evil and bad and there's nothing good, nothing he ever does is good, and everything he says is the absolute embodiment of evil, you're not looking at him like a realistic person. Like that's not a person, that's a caricature, right? And likewise, if you're, if you defend everything that Biden never says or does, or Hillary Clinton never said or did, and must defend it at all costs and must condemn Trump at all costs, you out yourself as unreasonable. So
Yeah. I mean, so you don't think, and I hate to sound judgmental here. I'm not trying to get you to be judgmental either.
no,
But
go for it, man.
from what you're seeing, the fruit that you see, do you think it's silly for Christians to try to portray Trump as a Christian?
I Again, I don't know Donald Trump's heart in that
Sure.
way,
Right.
so I
And
I
yeah.
can't I can't say what he actually in his heart of hearts believes. A lot of his attitudes and behaviors are, seem very non-Christian to me, but I don't feel the need to portray him as a Christian, because, like I said, whether or not he is, a true Christian, I would love for him to be a true Christian, but it's not important to my identity as a Christian that I portray Donald Trump as one.
Okay.
That,
Is
so
is it do you think it hurts as someone who's a conservative and wants to see policies pushed, or want to see policies in place that line up with your values and what you believe are the best ways to achieve those values? Do you think it's harmful actually, and actually backfires more often than not when conservatives do try to defend Trump's every move? Do you think that pushes more moderates away from the what you perceive to be the better choice? Do you think that causes unnecessary, is that pouring unnecessary gasoline on the fire?
yeah, I mean, I think it at least mimics zealotry, which drives, I think, drives people to the opposite pole. So I was talking about, when you out yourself as unreasonable about something, then people are gonna be more attuned to push back to you. I mean, if you can recognize, yeah, I mean, these are the obvious flaws, but I'm still gonna vote for them because of the alternatives are unacceptable to me, things like that. I think that's a lot more reasonable, as opposed to trying to portray something as it's not, or as it's clearly not. So that, again, you hurt your own credibility
Yeah,
when you do that. And I think
that's a good way to put it.
yeah, I think that's detrimental to your cause as a conservative, if you're going to stake all your credibility on Trump's righteousness, if you will.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that hurts your cause, generally speaking. If you can't recognize the flaws in someone because you're so ideologically blind, I think it outs you as an activist and a zealot, and hurts your cause to appeal to other people.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's a good way to put it. What do you think of pastors and um, celebrity preachers who openly and publicly endorse political candidates, whether it's on the right or the left? Like, where do you think they are? Do you think that they cross the line? Do you think that they are? What do you think of that?
Um, I mean, I think it's certainly their right to do so if they want to. I mean, individual liberties and freedom of association. I'm a big believer in that. You can support or not support
Yeah,
whoever
I'm
or
not
whatever
talking.
cause
Yeah,
you
I'm not
want.
talking legally.
Mhm.
But as a Christian, what do you think is the? Because I don't. I stay away from publicly endorsing.
Yeah, I would prefer that they don't make a case of publicly endorsing them. I think because they hold sway in a very deep way over their congregation, a faith-filled way. And I think for better or worse, whether you like this or not, I mean, you hold a really important position in a very deep part of your congregation's spirit and their mindset. You know, they do lift you up as sort of a beacon of their values and where their values lie, to a certain extent. Not that they need to agree with you or anything, but they sort of see their pastor, I think, as a as a marker of, to some extent, as a marker of some level of righteousness.
Yeah,
So I think that gives you a little bit of an uneven sway compared to someone who's not their pastor. So for you to come out and support that, I think, while certainly legal and allowable, I think is probably a bit maybe not taboo, but gauche. Maybe shouldn't be done um, uh, for the sake of not trying to indoctrinate through your faith relationship with them, their politics. So that was a long-winded answer. I'm sorry, but yeah, I
no,
think that they should probably encourage faith-based principles without necessarily um, pumping for one candidate and trying to basically convert their congregation into pumping for that candidate. Because I don't think I think political point of views can outgrow from your religious stance, but they shouldn't be the point of your religious beliefs.
yeah, no. That's a great way to put it. I am very interested, especially in the last 4 to 8 years, in how our faith should inform our politics, and where our I wouldn't even say where our faith should stay out of politics. I don't think our faith stays out of politics at all, but I think that where our faith is so supersedes our politics that it's like I used the adultery example last week. I don't think legislating adultery is going to fix the root of that problem. That's a Jesus, Holy Spirit, solution that making something illegal doesn't fix. And that's why I'm like, no, you can't legislate morality. My faith in Jesus as the only one who can do that makes me say the government should stay out of that, because it's
Yeah.
not going to work.
Mhm.
You try to legislate a faith that's against my faith. You can't legislate a belief. You can't legislate a worship of Jesus. But I do think our faith should inform how we vote, and I don't think we should stray away from talking about politics. I think I'm not a believer in staying away from certain topics in the church, but I am very cautious about being a pastor who comes off, even hints at endorsing a candidate or a party from a platform and using my pulpit to do that. And some people have alluded to the fact that that other churches don't do that because of the 501c3 status and all that.
Mhm.
For me, that has nothing to do with it. Absolutely zero to do with it. It's I understand that if I promote this candidate, then this camp they're gonna have a hard time hearing about Jesus from me
Mhm.
because of me promoting this candidate, and that's the last thing I want. Um, but at the same time, I do think we need to address difficult topics, including controversial political ones, and that's kind of the reason why I'm doing this podcast with different people. Y'all can do it, right? Y'all can do it, and
Yeah.
I can facilitate that. And I'm certainly I don't hold, when I'm having private conversations, I don't hold back. I share my opinions and my convictions on things, but that's as a citizen. That's not as a pastor. Um, so yeah, that's how I'm navigating that tension, and I'm certainly open to you or anybody else critiquing that that strategy, that balance. But that's kind of
No, I
where I'm at
appreciate
with it.
you having the stance that you do, because yeah, you would have to. It's a good point about distracting, from your ultimate goal of bringing people to Jesus. When doing that may send them off. They have to look to, oh, this is that Trump supporter or that Biden supporter or whatever, that filthy Democrat or that filthy Republican. How am I gonna listen to him talk about Jesus when everything he stands for is garbage?
Yeah,
So it is hard. And me as just a member of the church, it doesn't hold nearly as much sway, me declaring my support or my views, as it does for you. So you're in a tough position there, but I think you're handling it the right way with not openly supporting one candidate over another, and you're not trying to sway your congregation by doing that.
well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think we need to be able to have these conversations, and
Oh yeah.
I mean, just I will talk about issues or justice issues or obviously moral issues, and people have people, because they have been politicized. People walk away with, oh, he's been duped by the liberal media, or he's been duped by Fox News, and it's and that's just that there are connotations that I don't think we can get away from at this point in our culture. But I don't think we should avoid talking about them at the same time. And this is just kind of a way to do that. This podcast, and having
Yep.
people like you who are willing to say, this is how I voted and this is why.
Mhm.
I think is at least potentially very informative. And I hope people don't walk away going, oh, Tom, he's a typical conservative. I hope we showed that you're not. So I want to close these times in prayer.
Yes.
One of the things that you said to me about generosity, I want to pray that for the people watching. Um, Jesus, ultimately, if we're followers of you, you have called us to be generous with our money, with our wealth. And living in America, we're wealthy. So regardless of how much we make, I pray that we would be a generous people, that we would not rely on the government to do what you have called your church, your people to do, and that we would be generous, especially to those in our own community of faith, those who are struggling, those who are hurting, that we would truly understand that we are blessed to be a blessing to others, and that we would leverage any wealth that we have to that end. I pray that everything else that Tom talked about today is helpful and informative to people, even those who disagree with him, that they can better understand where perhaps the other side is coming from. And I pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.